Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Russ Winter is my guest. Russ is a researcher. He's a blogger. He's done videos on YouTube, and he's written extensively on looking at some of the, I guess you might say, the news behind the news, what we don't always, the kind of information we don't always receive from the official sources. And I would suggest that that really is our job as citizens, to do so responsibly and to try to look at things that may not be covered properly by the mainstream press, which I generally don't believe. Russ, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I call it hidden history, hidden events. And the reason I've come on your show is that I've actually read your book on assassinations and seen some of your podcasts, and I think that you're a good contributor.
Thank you very much.
I'm hoping we can have a good exchange.
Yeah, me too. And look, the First Amendment was created, the freedom of the recognition of the natural right to have freedom of speech, freedom of press, not to keep people from saying the F word and the S word, which is what they tell us now, but it has to do with investigating political corruption and conspiracy. And this idea that there isn't conspiracy is absurd, because of course, we know there's criminal conspiracy. That's why we have the Department of Justice. So why would we not assume that there isn't political conspiracy? Whenever you have a situation where there's money and power and things that are desirable to people, there are going to be conspiracies to obtain money and power. And that means political intrigue. And my book is about assassinations, attempted assassinations, conspiracies that were rumored around someone's untimely death. And I take a look at the politics of what was going on at the time that the person died. And you find that sometimes the removal of a person results in a major shift in how policy continues and how even society continues, which then begs the question of who benefits from that. What point of view is trying to enhance their power or stop a threat to their power? And so naturally, we have to use such technique to investigate possible political conspiracy in the same way that a police detective would investigate a criminal conspiracy.
Yeah, the assassination thing has been, they've gone down the road of the lone wolf, and I think that's basically an intelligence operation or backstory to just get people looking at one person. They just run it all the time. They just run it continually to this day on just about everything, whether it's crimes, whether it's certain events that are taking place. It's just always a lone wolf, and it just defies any logic that you would have one person being able to carry this stuff up. Now, they've also carried it into a program of compromising people. They've gotten very, very sophisticated at that. And I think that with modern technology, train coming through. Okay.
Well, with modern technology being what it is, it's much easier to blackmail people. And I find that I don't think that I'm going too far out on a limb to state that anyone who obtains high levels of power is either someone who has some blackmail, some skeletons in the closet, or there's someone who has sold out so completely to an establishment that they're doing their bidding and that they're acceptable to them. So,
that's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. Yep. It's very organized, and some of these characters are strange. I mean, they're just strange characters. Bill Clinton was a strange character. Obama came from a strange background. I mean, the Bushes were just CIA all the way. So if they're not part of the family, they get people in there that they can work with and really control. And I think that most of the world is ruled by a kakistocracy. That's the kind of the term I've come up with. Ruled by the worst. Yeah, rule by the worst.
It's also a kleptocracy, but that's another subject.
Right.
Let's briefly touch upon the Clintons, because I do a chapter in my book, The Clinton Body Count, something we've all heard about. Now, I'm not here to point fingers personally, because I have no idea. We don't know what really went on. However, it is our responsibility to take a look at a pattern of people who met their untimely demise, who were in close proximity to the Clintons, and who somehow threatened possibly their power. And I think that the Clintons are a perfect example. I mean, they're obviously, egomaniacs or power hungry. They're extremely greedy people who are willing to do the bidding of the sort of the establishment, the liberal establishment, who then exchanges that benefit by looking the other way on their documented crimes. And they have this symbiotic relationship that has gone all the way back to their very beginning in the Arkansas State House and continued right through Hillary's presidential campaign.
And working with Bush. So it's not, it's not a Hegelian dialectic. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. These guys are in bed together. That's an important observation. So I don't get too partisan on this stuff. I'm certainly not a Republican. I used to be a Republican until I kind of woke up, but I'm certainly not a Democrat. I'm probably kind of an old populist.
Well, I think that President Trump said it best during his inaugural address and recently repeated it when he pointed out that his victory is not a partisan matter. It's not Democrat versus Republican. It's an attempt to return the governing responsibilities from the oligarchs to the people. And, I think that is what he's trying to do, at least as far as I can see. Of course, we don't know the inner workings, I grant you. But going back to the Clinton body count, I mean, I do a pretty good count on that. And there are some very strange goings on around the Clintons. Now, people might say, oh, that's ridiculous. How could I make such a stupid comment that the Clintons would have somebody knocked off? I think that when you have power at that level and ambition like that, ask yourself, if you were that intense on gaining power and you had such extraordinary change, ability to exercise that power, and somebody comes along and they threaten that power and they threaten to take away everything that you're about, you don't think that you'd consider having them knocked off or at least silenced somehow? I mean, it makes perfect sense. It goes to human nature. So I think, of course, they probably had. I mean, it makes me uncomfortable to talk about it, but I think that there is definitely a pattern there.
Well, certainly, but there's also a pattern of death squads just about everywhere. I think there are people being killed in fairly large numbers, getting rid of, or they'll get rid of them. I mean, you kind of wrote an interesting article on Tim Russert, and I kind of wrote my own article in response.
Yes.
Now, there's a good example of just a guy that was just sort of getting in people's face a little too much across the board. Clinton, Bush, he was getting kind of to the bottom of the war in Iraq and questioning a lot of that. He was just too good. He really was. I mean, he's kind of what we should have all the time. Tim Russert should be everyday character on American television. Instead, he ended up being some odd rarity. They probably knocked him off. I don't think he had a heart attack. He had parents that lived in their 80s. He had good genes. He was checked out by his doctor, given a stress test. He's a little pudgy and kind of a doughboy, but he was only 58.
He was in good health. He was a young man. Now, the piece that I wrote on Russert, and it only focused on one aspect because everything you say is true. He was a fairly down the middle, honest reporter, almost a naive reporter, in that he didn't really understand the powers that he was dealing with. During the election of 2004, he had on Meet the Press, which he was the host, both candidates, George W. Bush and John Kerry. And he asked both of them about Skull and Bones, which they were members of when they were students at Yale, and which they took an oath to, and which they have a secrecy with. And they both answered the question almost, it's uncanny to watch the video.
Yeah, the same answer.
Not only the same answer, but literally the same look on their faces. It was almost like they were the same person. It was like, we don't discuss this. And then they kind of smirked and moved on. And I don't think it's far-fetched to suggest that by bringing that up on both occasions, Russert opened up a whole line of inquiry into a part of American politics that most people don't know about. And most people had never heard of Skull and Bones up until that point. And all of a sudden, it's becoming a mainstream speculation. You had that guy in the audience, remember the "Don't tase me, bro," right? Don't tase me. Why were they tasing him? Because he was asking John Kerry about Skull and Bones. And they dragged him out of the auditorium. He was screaming.
Yeah, Russell was definitely into Inconvenient Truths, and that was a classic. Definitely was, because I think it kind of, like you say, it woke everybody up that it's a big club. You know, George Carlin, as George Carlin put it, it's a big club and you aren't in it.
Yeah.
And then he went on and he was probing into the Iraq War, asking some tough questions of the press secretary. I'm trying to remember his name, the guy who wrote the book. And it was 8 days after that interview that he just died. Well, go back and look at that interview. You know what? It's scrubbed. You can't find it anymore. In fact, you can't really find much of any of Russert. So I was doing the research after reading your article, and said, I'm going to write my own article on this. I was doing the research on this, and I go, where are his interviews? You can find them, but they're certainly not on the first 3 or 4 pages of Google. The first 3 or 4 Googles is nothing but accolades and
all the
remembrances.
But he's been airbrushed out of history, his actual work, and everybody is patting him on the back. What a great guy! Throw another trophy on the shelf. But the reality is that his work, this is part of history. The stuff, somebody went back and they did some research, not to get into a historical issue, but Senator Joseph McCarthy, who I think was also driven to his death, but he went out, his original contention was that there were 50 members of the U.S. State Department and the federal government who had worked for Stalin and who were KGB agents or abettors. And there was an outrage about this. Oh, how could he say this? And this list, he didn't reveal it to the public, mainly because he was trying to protect people in case he didn't have everything right about it. But he was vilified for having the list. Well, in 2005, I think it's an author went back to try to find the list, and it was gone. It was. They went to libraries.
His list of 50 was gone.
You can't get it.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
there's got to be at least 50.
He had other lists too. That all of that stuff has disappeared. It's completely vanished from access. We will never get it. And
as a researcher, I run into that a lot, and you really have to learn, if you're a member of the public, to get off of Google's first pages. You got to get way back. Yeah, you got to go way back, and you got to really come up with some pretty arcane, what seems to be arcane stuff, but actually that's where a lot of the truth is, because they can't get rid of everything.
No, and I think Google now has become much more censored than it was even a few years ago, because when I was doing my books, and I'm working on a book now that's not getting into, it's more philosophical, so I'm not doing this kind of deep research. But when I was doing the research from one of my books, you could get to it, but you had to do a lot of digging, and you had to patiently go through many, many, many pages and go way back. And I would always try to find a site from the New York Times, to make sure that no one claimed I was, not a legitimate source. And you could find that back then, because the New York Times often does tell the truth, but they bury it. They'll put it in the back page. But with the wonders of the internet, you could then get to it. No longer. I mean, now they're getting rid of everything. It's all disappearing as we go.
Yeah, sometimes you could find it in books, older books that people wrote. Right. Because if you go back to the 20s, even the 1910s, 30s, 40s, that period back there, people were writing real books about real topics. Right. And sometimes you can do like a search, a couple of different words, and it'll pop up some very interesting passages in books. That's a real good research method that I've used. But it is tough. Boy, there's nothing on YouTube anymore. It's just all cat videos.
Oh, I know, right, exactly. And I mean, it's YouTube. I mean, I still believe in it. I'm still trying to build a channel, but my faith in it has really been shaken. It's not so much censoring out stuff that's insightful or that's advocating violence. I get that. That's okay. But it's really gotten down to legitimate opinion that it runs against the left establishment, and that's wrong. I mean, that's a dangerous path to go on. YouTube is huge. They've got a virtual monopolistic power over what they're doing, during the 2 days when my show was pulled down, I did research on what is an alternative to YouTube, and I really didn't find anything legitimate. It was just a bunch of sketchy sites. So they've got the footprint, and they can do this. And I think that they're going to increase it as the election gets near.
Yeah, I mean, at one time I was fairly active at Reddit, and I would go to the R conspiracy site, and there were some good contributors over there. You could find good material, and they started banning them. They would put periodic bans on me. I would really have a struggle at Reddit. And the Reddit conspiracy site, everything I put anywhere else would immediately get taken down. Immediately.
Well, Reddit, I think, is owned by Google, isn't it? Or it's owned by Facebook.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure about that.
I think Facebook actually owns. They own Google, they own YouTube, and I think they own a lot of things that we don't even know about. So, yeah, I mean, it's becoming unfortunately. I mean, when I got into this thing, I had naive, idealistic feelings that I could do a program which really delved into some issues in a deep way, in a responsible way. And now I can see that it's no better than the editorial pages in the major papers. Anyways, but Russ, you've done some research on former Prime Minister David Cameron of Great Britain. Talk about that.
Yeah, you have a term that's pretty good, a good term, money power, in terms of maybe the driving forces behind at least an element of the conspiracies. Because money does talk and control. Now, the interesting thing about David Cameron is that he's kind of a hybrid character. He wrote. Let's see, where's my Cameron? Okay, he acted surprised when it was revealed that he had two very high-powered ancestors. Now, this is going to be interesting to you, and it may be a useful template for us to use, because we do kind of come from a little different point of view of who's behind this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've kind of learned a lot myself, and I believe there is a kind of a combination. It's a hybrid of Jewish banking and British banking.
Mm-hmm. City of London.
Yeah, City of London, and they're actually intermarried. And there's a book that was written in the 30s, it's a forbidden book. You can't even find it anymore. That lists all these families that have they're intermarried, and they're kind of incestuous. They kind of marry amongst themselves.
Was it by Nesta Webster?
Well, she gets into it somewhat, but it's actually another book written by an MP that you can't even get. Again, you can't even. It's forbidden. You can't get it. I read parts of it. It was too long. I didn't really particularly care to just go through name after name after name. But I got the point. So they're intermarried families. Now, Cameron's great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather was Emil Levita. Levita, is that pronounced correctly? Mm-hmm. He was a banker,
right,
from Standard Charter Bank. The family hailed from Frankfurt and the Rhineland-Palatinate area of Germany, was where you find a lot of these people come from. And you've gotten into the Frankist issue, and you've done good work on that too, because this is a tie-in. So you're doing good work. Your interpretation might be a little different than mine, but you're getting the idea in terms of how I look at it, in terms of my worldview. So you have a cesspool of these people coming out of this Rhineland-Palatine, Hesse area of Germany, and this is one of them. Now, his great-grandfather is the one that really gets the attention. His name is Arthur Levate. Mm-hmm. Now, L.G. Pine, the editor of Perk's Peerage, wrote that Arthur was a prime example of Jewish intermarriage with aristocracy. The Jews have made themselves so closely connected with the British peerage that the two classes are unlikely to suffer loss, which is not mutual. That's what the Perk's Peerage said. So Arthur marries Stephanie Cooper, who is described by one source as a cousin of the royal family. Mm-hmm. So then his other great-grandfather is Sir Ewan Cameron, a Scotsman. Mm-hmm. He's one of the top of the heap of the City of London bankster scene, serving as serving as the chief chairman of Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which is basically your opium bank. Your opium trade, and played a key role in arranging loans from the Rothschild family to the Empire of Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. So this prime minister, he comes from a British bankster and a Jewish bankster,
yes.
intermarried. And I think that pretty much defines some of the money power. It's a mistake to say, well, it's all Jewish. That's just not correct. It's simply not correct.
Right.
I even at one time kind of had that point of view and had to kind of break from it in my work. And
my point of view is that it's not a Jewish. It doesn't matter if they observe the Sabbath on a Saturday or on a Sunday. The point is that these are people are atheistic, internationalist, moneyed people who live in their own universe.
And they may be Frank. A lot of them may be Frankists.
Well, the Sabadian Frankist conspiracy, I have covered that. That has been very damaging to the Jewish people, in my opinion. It has been a major corruption, in the same way that the Illuminati was a major corruption in the Christian world, in the Catholic world particularly. And these are things that basically were movements away from faith. They believed in, the world and colony, that there was an elite. I mean, they were occultists, essentially. The idea of the elect, people who have some kind of a super consciousness who can rule over the world, and they feel entitled to do that, and that they're actually doing good when they do that. And it dovetails perfectly with the emergence of central banking, which happened really in the latter part of the 18th and then into the 19th century, when central banks became prominent, eventually culminating in the development in the United States of the Federal Reserve in 1913. But I mean, the Bank of England, which was established by Paterson and King William and Mary when they came back, this House of Orange, that was really the beginning of like an official bank. And the whole idea of central banking and fiat currency came from from Venice and from the Hanseatic League of Baltic states, when they started issuing paper to conduct trade. And then they realized the power of that paper, and then they could manipulate the value of the paper. So they began this process of making money from money itself, rather than making money from legitimate trade in goods and services. And they figured out how to usurp that power from sovereign governments. I wrote a book on this topic, the Art and Science of American Money, where I showed that every administration from Washington right up till today has had its sort of slightly under the radar struggle with this money power. In fact, Martin Van Buren's book is called The Money Power. And it was Andrew Jackson.
Certainly Andrew Jackson, Lincoln to a degree.
Yeah,
right?
Lincoln more than to a degree. Lincoln issued fiat currency, greenbacks, and he's criticized for that today. But the fact is that you had British bankers, including Rothschild and his agent in New York, that being August Belmont, go to the White House and say, we're going to loan you money to fight the Civil War, and we want this exorbitant amount of interest. And Lincoln told them to jump in a lake.
Right.
Instead, issued fiat currency.
I think what happened with this Illuminism, I call it Illuminism rather than Illuminati, because Illuminati is almost sort of a catchword. But Illuminism and this Frankism is they really understand the value of psychopathy, because you really get the upper hand on people, because most people are asleep. Most people are good people. That the little people of all races, creeds, colors. But then you've got these psychopaths, and they're probably about 4 or 5% of the population, have gotten really organized around this Illuminism and this Frankism theme and banking to gain power, and that's essentially the money power right there. It's this sort of intermarriage, right. And this Cameron is a good example of it.
He is, and there's actually a good book on the American Jewish banking, which called Our Crowd by Stephen Birmingham. I interviewed him years ago, where he shows how the Schiffs and the Warburgs and the Seligmans, these families all developed a system of private banking. They all married each other. There was intermarriage, and they founded organizations like Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers and other private banking institutions.
And intelligence operations, big time.
Oh, absolutely. And they worked hand in glove with the Protestant elite, like the Rockefellers and Brown Brothers and the Harrimans. And they seem to have formed this sort of tacit alliance. these are not religious people. This isn't Judaism, nor is it
Right.
Christianity. It's a subversion.
It's psychopathy.
Yeah, I think that about describes
or
it.
kakistocracy. I mean,
I
that's a
like
good
that
catch-up.
term.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And so what we have now is our entire monetary system, our money is controlled by private bankers and investors, both domestic and international, who are not loyal to the United States, who don't care about the value of the working man's dollar. They're interested in their own profits, and they have an ideology of world order. They interlock with other central bankers all over the world. Now, I think that the Federal Reserve System is better than like the Chinese system or some third world country systems where the bank is you have the bank outright controlled by the government, and they just print money. I mean, it's very corrupt. At least the Federal Reserve is separate. I think there has to be a separate entity. But that separate entity doesn't have to be a private bank. And that's what the Federal Reserve is. It can be some sort of look, I use in my book the Massachusetts model, and I'm from Massachusetts. There's a lot of things that came out of this state that were very innovative. And that was in colonial times, the Massachusetts Bay Colony set up a farm bank, basically a bank that was run by a council of people appointed by the state, by the colony, that would issue very low interest loans to bankers and businessmen who could come up with collateral, either a farm or land or a business plan. The profit on the interest would go toward the colony, toward developing infrastructure. That's how Boston developed its lamplights. I mean, it was and there was no taxes, and business expanded, and the currency was based on the good faith and credit of the colony of Boston. I think that's getting close to a more legitimate system. Not perfect, but
it's more decentralized community type
that's
stuff.
right. And other states started imitating this, and the colonies took off economically. I mean, in Maryland, if you go to the Maryland State House today, you have a little building on the grounds where they would count tobacco, because tobacco was the currency of that state. And they would issue currency based on the amounts of tobacco. And the economies were thriving until the Bank of England got aware of it. When Benjamin Franklin explained to them in England, they said, how do you issue your money? And he explained it. And so they moved in and they created a monopoly and said only Bank of England notes and gold and silver coins would be recognized as currency. And they banned all fiat currency. And that is one of the major contributors to the American Revolution. Not discussed in class when you study the Revolution. But
and that's a pretty good segue into your book, because in your book you go through a number of them that I've also covered. I think McKinley is a especially interesting case. I could develop
talk about that. Yeah, let me hear about, because I know that my understanding, and I do cover McKinley. I didn't get into anything major other than that Kolsko was an anarchist. He was executed very quickly after the.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is money power again, and what people today don't realize is that it's that whole period from say Napoleon on to World War I, when they instituted the Federal Reserve, was a lot of pushback to money power.
Yes,
there were candidates like William Jennings Bryan. There were populists. And they would name these guys out. They would just go down the list and name them constantly, and all the usual suspects.
The Gold speech is incredible.
Yeah. I mean, so there was no big secret like it is now. So now it's all it was a lone gunman, the lone wolf. Right. So the history has just been completely polluted and tossed away, which is why going into these assassinations, I think, is a good exercise, because it awakens you to what's going on. Now, McKinley was a strong opponent of sound money, not loose money, but he utilizes protection. He was a protectionist. He was kind of an American firster. He was kind of anti-British. He didn't like the British, so he would tend to rail on them. Maybe it was popular at the time politically. I mean, I wasn't there, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was, got votes to say anti-British sentiments. Mm-hmm. He was only 58. He would have been around. He'd been elected by a large majority, against William Jennings Bryan, and William Jennings Bryan is one of my favorites. But
Right then, yeah.
But McKinley beat him handily, and he would have been around for 15 more years, blocking the plans of implementing central banking. So in your book, you covered the anarchists, and I think the anarchists are actually used as point of the spear.
Okay.
So that's your leftist, and they can get work with the bankers. There's a lot more going on there than meets the eye. They utilize them. So you want me to kind of go through the whole story?
Yeah, no, this is like, just to briefly comment, it's sort of what they call the scissor effect. The lowest blade of the scissor is the anarchists, the street activists, the thugs, people who paganize, oh, this is for the people, and they go in and they do the violence. The upper thrust of the scissor is the boardrooms and the executives and the insiders who are like, working behind the scenes to symbiotically help the anarchists without appearing to do so.
Well, I can't even pronounce the guy's name. Leon Kostkos,
something else.
Kostkos. He hooked up with the anarchists, Emma Goldman in particular.
Yes.
And Emma Goldman was a firebrand. She had been involved with the Homestead strike, and her boyfriend had seriously injured a plant superintendent and gone to prison. So they had a history of agitation, and Kostkos got together with them, hanging out with them in Cleveland, ends up going to Chicago, gets past a pistol, gets past money. And after McKinley was assassinated, everybody goes, oh, yeah, it's the anarchists. They were onto it. The New York Times was quickly running with the anarchist story. And then it all just kind of peeled apart. And so when things kind of peel off, usually sometimes the first impressions are the best. And then when they just kind of go away, that sort of tells you that maybe there's a hand there.
Yeah, things start to get crafted. I mean, the same thing happened with the 9/11 attack. Anyways, but I don't want to digress, but go on.
Okay, so he shows up in Buffalo, and the main character behind this is a guy named George Cortelyou. Now, George Cortelyou was McKinley's personal secretary or his chief of staff, but he had been placed there by the New York banking community, and he had actually worked for Grover Cleveland, the Democrat. Now, the story goes is that Cortelyou had been warned that there was going to be a problem in Buffalo, and had told the president, well, we don't know that because the president's not around to tell his version of the story. In reality, what Cortelyou did, and his mentor was Wilson Bissell, a New York Democrat, who they have a long intelligence history in the CIA, going all the way up into the Bay of Pigs. They've been around forever, this family. So they actually mentored Cortelyou and got him kind of into position. And he was Bissell was a member of the Skull and Bones. He practiced law out of Buffalo, and his law partner was Grover Cleveland. So Cleveland was part of the Eastern establishment and was influenced by oligarch interest. McKinley, really, I think less so. I don't think he was anti-plutocratic, but he was America, more of an America firster.
Yeah, he's a little bit independent, kind of he actually thought he was president.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big mistake.
Same problem Kennedy ran.
That's exactly
I think
right.
Kennedy had that same problem, but anyway.
Okay, yeah. So it was a situation where, if you believe in Hanlon's razor, Hanlon's razor is something I always bring up. Hanlon's razor holds that you can always explain things away by incompetence. It's bullshit. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of malice out there. So people have to get rid of this notion of Hanlon's razor, because you just hear it over and over and over again. I mean, everything I've ever researched, my 1,000 articles, you can't just dismiss with Hanlon's razor and incompetence. It just doesn't fly with me, especially now, because I've really dug into these topics. So that's kind of the story with Cortelyou. So he's there on every step of the way with the bad decisions leading to McKinley's death. So at the Buffalo Exposition, Louis Babcock was made nervous by a joke at lunch that at the restaurant that the president might be shot during the reception. So he and comedy of errors Cortelyou then arranged for a dozen artillerymen to attend the reception in full dress uniform and had them stand in the aisles. But these artillerymen were not trained in police work, and they just crowded the front area in front and obstructed the views of the detectives and the Secret Service to protect the president. And so part of the reason was for bringing McKinley in was to swell the gate receipts so that it was heavily advertised. And Cortelyou did nothing to prevent the promotion. He claims he talked to the president, but he had nothing to prevent the promotion of it whatsoever. But anyway, jumping ahead, the assassination was relatively easy. He just went in and shot him twice, and one ended up being the fatal wound. But instead of getting McKinley to a real hospital, Cortelyou managed to get him to a poorly provisioned medical room at the Exposition. And I've got a picture of it. It doesn't even have any light. It was about 5 or 6 in the afternoon in September, so it was getting dark. They didn't even bring any light. And so the best surgeon in the city is in Niagara Falls performing a neck operation. The president of the United States is at the Exposition, and the guy who handles the fair is gone? Really?
Very strange.
Very strange. So when he's interrupted during the procedure on September 6th, he told that he was needed in Buffalo. He said, I can't leave, not even for the president of the United States. So in walk Dr. Herman Minter and Dr. Matthew Mann. Matthew Mann is a gynecologist. He'd never done any surgery,
right?
Unless you call him delivering babies or cesarean surgery, but he's not.
Right, not qualified.
He's not a trauma. These guys aren't trauma surgeons, and they just kind of goofed around. They basically never got the bullet out. They found the bullet later fairly easily in the autopsy, but when they were operating on him, they didn't get the bullet out of him. And then there was a kind of a primitive X-ray at the fair. They said, "Nah, we don't need that. That'll just disturb the patient."
Mm-hmm.
So these guys are widely criticized for malpractice. So it's not like they haven't come under criticism.
No, I understand.
So they never got the bullet out. And Mann was quoted as saying, "A bullet, once it ceases to move, does little harm."
Can I just interject here? Because
yeah.
I also, there's the same thing that happened around the shooting of Garfield, and also the deaths of William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, all very suspicious, all of which I get into in my book, that in the aftermath of the event, the medical care was very, very suspect. I mean, they were basically, it almost appeared, especially in the case of Harrison, that he had been poisoned after the fact. But, it's not uncommon that that's a part of the situation.
Yeah,
Garfield
too. Garfield was
Garfield.
That's what I'm more familiar with. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the bullet fell out of him on the hospital bed, but they hadn't bothered to take it out. And the medical care that he got was abominable.
Yeah, so they're done with this initial surgery, and rather than taking him to a proper hospital, they move him to the nearby home of John Milburn to convalesce.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Milburn is a friend of Grover Cleveland, so there's this. It's kind of like Dallas. Buffalo is like the Dallas of that era, almost. Is kind of how I visualize it. It's a cesspool of conspirators. So they take him to the home of Milburn to convalesce, and the same doctors come in. So they didn't even replace the gynecologist.
Wow.
The Dr. Park didn't even show up.
So the real doctor never showed up.
Never showed up. Never took him to a hospital. And Milburn was a prominent attorney who represented Standard Oil, the New York Stock Exchange, Metropolitan Street Railway, and was the president of the New York City Bar Association. So it just so happened that President McKinley died 8 days later in his home, not even really getting any medical care.
Yeah.
So the main issue is gangrene, because they failed to track the bullet and find the round, and then Thomas Edison shows up, and he's accompanied by a trained operator of his new X-ray machine. They didn't use it. Said, no, we don't need it. Well, don't you think you need to get the bullet out?
Right.
Nah, everything's going fine. He's stable. So he died, had gangrene all over the wall. So here's what happens with Cortelyou afterwards. He's like the Johnny on the spot type of guy especially during the 1907 financial panic. He was Secretary of Treasury.
Uh-huh. J.P.
Morgan. But let's cover him a little bit beforehand. He was Secretary of Commerce and Labor. They had the combined departments in 1903. And then he became the chairman of the Republican National Committee. So he's responsible for raising money for the Republicans and for the Roosevelt's 1904 campaign. And then he becomes the Postmaster General, and then he becomes Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, just in time for the panic of 1909. Now, there's an article that I found. I kind of did some digging on it on the internet. It's still there. It's kind of wonderful that you can still find these little snippets that there's too much for them to bury. You can't bury everything.
Yeah.
And it's the San Francisco Call did an investigation about Cortelyou raising a monster Wall Street slush fund for Roosevelt. So he was the money man.
Well, now that brings up an interesting question, which is that in a case of assassination, you have to look at who benefits. Cui bono is the Latin term. What about Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, Teddy Roosevelt didn't bring in the central bank, but they weren't quite ready for that. But the setup was the panic of 1907. So Teddy Roosevelt, I think, he was supposed to be antitrust, but there's sort of a backstory. And not necessarily, some of these guys really aren't quite as the big heroes as they're portrayed. So you could argue that, well, did Teddy Roosevelt really benefit from this? That's a good argument, but all I'm seeing...
But he became president of the United States. He benefited from it.
Yeah, he did. And what did he do? It's hard for me to point the finger at him, but the people around him is a different story, particularly this George Cortelyou. And so Roosevelt's selecting these men, or being given these men. And he's supposed to be, antitrust and fighting against the big banks and big international banking. Is he really? So when they had the panic, Cortelyou was summoned by J.P. Morgan himself to New York to, quote, work by the financier's side. And the Treasury had already deposited $5 million in banks there to shore them up. But by law, the government could only deposit government funds in national banks, such as J.P. Morgan. Well, it was the trust companies and the state banks that were in trouble. So by doing that, by giving them large deposit, it put J.P. Morgan and his cronies in a position to exploit the panic. They consolidated $1 billion worth of banks because they had the money and they really had the backing of Cortelyou, standing behind them. That's huge.
Oh yeah, of course.
That's just huge. Oh,
that's a very interesting subject. Yeah, and then you had also you had Nelson Aldrich and the Jekyll Island meeting at that time as well, which didn't go over until Wilson became president.
And Cortelyou was promoting after the panic, he was out there, the biggest cheerleader of all, promoting, well, we need a central bank. Look at how great J.P. Morgan was. He saved the economy, blah, blah, blah. So the rest is history. And, like I say, Cortelyou lobbied heavily for the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And then nobody suspects him. But his fingerprints are all over there. I mean, this is a crazy conspiracy theory, probably to most people. But when you really look at the details and the action, and you just get rid of this Hanlon's razor nonsense, just set that aside, you're seeing a pattern of certainly not competent behavior, but I would say malice.
Well, let me ask you about while we're on that subject. I covered several theories around the assassination of President Kennedy. There's been a lot written about it, a lot of very good stuff. I mean, it's interesting that even to this day, there's still so much information classified. Why is it classified? All the people involved are probably dead now. There's no reason why. There's no national security threat. The Soviet Union is gone. But yet, even recently, President Trump tried to declassify information about the Kennedy assassination, and he only could do just so much. The rest of it was redacted. So we don't know what happened. We know that there are secrets, and that's a matter of fact. But one of the things that I looked at, and I can't prove this either way, maybe you have some information about it, Russ, is that the year, several months before the assassination, President Kennedy discovered a whole cache of silver coin in, I don't know if it was Fort Knox or wherever. It was uncirculated silver. And he arranged for the issuance of silver certificates, interest-free, did an end run around the Federal Reserve. We're talking about a huge amount of money that would be issued directly into the economy to help build his social programs, whatever it was. And that there are some who speculate that this was one of the contributing factors, not only to the assassination, but to the fact that, according to what I've read, and again, I can't verify any of it, the issuance of the silver certificates was stopped the day after the assassination by Johnson.
Yeah, that's probably one of many reasons they went after him.
Right.
He'd gotten rid of Dulles, and that was essentially your crime syndicate that was running the intelligence, and they were a crime syndicate.
Yeah, there's a totally went rogue, just like many people predicted. I mean, even Truman predicted it when he set it up. And Kennedy also, and I republished this speech in my book, and this is something that you can see on the Kennedy Library website. This isn't conspiracy, but he delivered this extraordinary speech in 1961 to the Publishers Association. It was at some award dinner or something, where he says, we should be aware of secret societies, beware of people who take oaths, because the only oath that they should take is to the Constitution, not to some group over and above that. And he went on at length about this.
Amazing speech, absolutely.
Oh yeah, and this is not conspiracy. This, as I say,
if you got to get, if people need to come over to the red pill, start paying attention to things like that. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the things that shocked me when I started looking at this stuff. That particular speech, what is he talking about? Well, now I think I know.
One more thing I want to point out about this, sort of as a side piece. Jimmy Carter was announced that he was going to be releasing the information about the Kennedy assassination. Right after that announcement, he was delivering a speech in Los Angeles, and two men were apprehended who were, it was an outdoor speech, and they were in the hotel room looking over the speech in the window. They were apprehended. They found, some guns and ammunition in the room. And they were interviewed. One of them was an illegal alien. The other was a bum. He was a vagrant. They were held for overnight, and then they were let go. One of them was named Raymond Lee Harvey, and the other one was named Oswaldo Munez. Get it? Now this, you can check any newspaper.
I've never heard that story. But
I remember reading.
The rabbit holes go deep.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is not conspiracy. I remember reading it at the time in the paper. It was reported, and the fact is that after that happened, Jimmy Carter backed down quick. No more release of Kennedy stuff. That was almost the end of his presidency. I mean, he was a changed man after that as president.
Well, it was a coup d'etat. I mean, for all kinds of reasons. It seems like everybody had a gripe against him. It was kind of a club. Again, the club came in and they probably said.
I think one of the best books on that is by Jerome Corsi. And he just concludes that it's all true. I mean, everybody involved. I mean, Kennedy was not.
So do you think James Files did the trigger?
That I haven't heard.
Yeah, you might want to look into that one. James Files is in prison in the 1990s, an old man, and he's just sitting there going, "Yeah." He says, "You can believe me if you want. He says, "I don't give a damn if you believe me or not, but I'll tell you what happened. I'm not asking for any money, but here's how it went down. I was the guy on the grassy knoll," and described it in amazing detail. who brought him in. He was brought in by the Chicago mob to, but it was a convention. I mean, there's like a spook convention there.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I mean, that's an amazing story, and once in a while I'll run across somebody that says, "Oh yeah, it was Lee Harvey Oswald," and I just have to gag when I hear that.
And also what's even more, in a way, more interesting is the Robert Kennedy assassination.
Yep.
And I get into that as well. And there's some very strange things about Sirhan, who has insisted that he doesn't remember anything that happened, and that there was almost like a tampering with his mind, his psyche. It gets into some very interesting questions about where he was just before the assassination. It's too much to get into right now, but there are some questions about MKUltra and whatnot around that. And
well, he had a handler. He had I'm trying to remember his name because I wrote an article on it. There's Esther Brooks, and then there's what's his name? Did you get the name of his handler?
I don't. I haven't really have to revisit that chapter, but just suffice to say that there's some very interesting things to look at around that assassination.
Well, he talks about going down in the basement and having coffee with some woman.
That's right. And then he blacked out.
Yeah, and he blacked out. Now, what that could have been, here's another topic I'll bring up, because I've kind of started looking into this a lot, is the drug scopolamine, which is known as devil's breath.
Right.
Now, they don't even have to do MKUltra on these people. Everybody goes, well, they do MKUltra. That doesn't sound likely. How can you hypnotize somebody? But, well, there's more to it than that. They're giving them drugs like scopolamine. And scopolamine, you don't even know if you can't even resist. You just do whatever they say. And
Russ, look, I mean, I think that everybody in their heart of hearts knows damn well what's going on with, for example, these school shootings and all of these mass murders. Every single one of these cases, these kids were on some kind of a psych drug. I don't think there's an exception to that. And if you read the fine print on those psych drugs, it's either suicide or homicide, beware of. And that, these are highly controlled substances. And to think that doesn't have something to do with this. I mean, they'll always say, oh, we'll confiscate everyone's guns. There's nothing to do with it. It was easier to get a gun back in the day. I mean, that's not the issue. The issue is what's going on in with these young people. These are younger people, in their psyche, and what kind of influence do these substances have?
Well, they have the whole country under zombie attack. It's not just that; it's just widespread. I've just wrote an article today about lead and lead pipes. There's still 18 million people in the United States being exposed to lead and pipes. The fluoride, and fluoride's maybe a little controversial, but you just got a bunch of zombies. But you also have scopolamine, and you know anything about this?
I haven't heard about it.
Have you followed what's called the smiley face killings?
No.
It's actually a bad name, but the smiley face killings involved the murder of probably about 300 young men around the United States, and they're just left in water.
Oh yes, I do know about this, and it happened. It's going on in Boston. Yep.
Right. Yep. And they're very, very strange cases. And
they are. You have some guy leaving a club at late in the night, 1 o'clock in the morning,
right,
and then he disappears. And it's not anything sexual either about this. They find the body, in the Charles River.
And usually they find the body in the Charles River after it's already been searched. So they take them somewhere. What they're doing is they're waterboarding them. I think there's like this little underground, and I think it's a high ranking. I don't think it's just a couple.
Yeah, we're getting into stuff that's really ugly and really troubling. But I feel it's incumbent on us to raise these questions and hopefully lead to other people doing this kind of research. It's not easy to do. It's not pleasant research. We don't want to think these things. It kind of, there's a thing I'm a student of sociology, and there's a thing in sociology called the control factor, which it's a natural tendency amongst human beings, similar to the Stockholm syndrome, in that we don't want to ascribe these kinds of things to people because they're so evil and they're so sinister, especially people that are put up as great revered figures. So we don't. We'll write it off. We'll don't think about this, and we denounce anyone who does bring it up. And I would suggest, because we should probably, I'd like to do more programming with you as we go, but I don't want to go too long. But I would suggest that that we need to look beyond that and realize that, we have to use our own instincts and our own thinking on these things and trust ourselves to.
Yeah, and believe your own eyes. If you're seeing it with your own eyes, you can't just be ridiculed. It's called gaslighting. That's what it is, gaslighting. Oh, you're crazy. You're, you're unstable. You belong in
It's like they say, who do you believe, me or your own eyes?
Yeah, and I got a little of that early on and kind of fell for it a little bit, and until I kept digging and digging and digging and going, and finally I just said, fuck you.
No, of course. But no,
look, that wasn't directed at you, Charles. Sorry.
Listen, I'm basically in the same boat, and it's a very difficult thing. But if we get enough people going to bat, then we'll bring things up and shine some light on the truth. Anyway, Russ, let my viewers and listeners know where they can find out more about you and about your work.
Well, the main site now is winterwatch.net, because I've been pretty much scrubbed everywhere else. But we do have we've got a following. There's some good commentators over there that add to the discussion, and it's pushing about 1,000 articles.
Good, and I thought you did a really good job with Timothy Kelly, who I've been following. He's great talk show host.
Yeah, there's 3 interviews with him that are on my site. So if you want to tolerate more of me.
No, it's great stuff. Listen, thanks for joining me this afternoon, Russ.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I'd be glad to come back.
Excellent. Yeah, let's stay in touch and let's do some more programming.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.